So we're going to start with our panelist introductions. On the very far right of me, we have Jordan Geiger from Black Lives Matter South Bend. Jordan is a South Bend, Indiana native and co-founder of Black Lives Matter South Bend. He worked as an educator in his community and recently served as the Director of Outreach for Black Lives Matter Grassroots, which is the chapter organizing arm of the global organization. In 2016, he returned to South Bend from graduate school and began working closely with Regina Williams Preston, who we have here today, and a group of young, private, passionate activists. Since his return, he has worked tirelessly towards justice for Black and poor South Bend residents. Some of his organizing wins include working with Regina to secure millions of dollars in home repairs for homeowners in low-income Black communities, stopping school board policies that would have revoked students' driver's licenses and work permits for truancy, pushing the budgeting city administration to conduct the city's first study on South Bend's racial wealth divide, organizing a rental assistance clinic for low-income families, providing nearly $400,000 in rental assistance, and working with West Side residents to completely shift the city's narrative around neighborhood development and economic inclusion.
Our second panelist in the center is Ms. Aletha Jones, part of the School Board of Trustees. As a member of the South Bend Community School Corporation Board of Trustees, former education chair for the NAACP South Bend branch, and a founding member of the Community Action for Education, also known as CAFE, Aletha is a leader in raising awareness of and fighting against the disproportionate and racist discipline experienced by Black and Indigenous people of color children and poor children in the South Bend Community School Corporation. In 1999, she joined Citizens United and started attending South Bend Community School Corporation Board meetings and pushing the school board to become more open and transparent in its decision-making. From this, she saw a need to continue the conversation and widen her base of support. So she became involved with the NAACP. Her work with the NAACP began with the statewide listening tour on the disproportionality of BIPOC youth being disciplined or assigned to special education classrooms. This tour spurred HEA 1419, which required the development of an evidence-based plan for improving school discipline and behavior. Through her work with CAFE, Aletha has helped raise awareness of the school to prison pipeline, which she describes as the pattern of things that can track a student to prison or poverty, and includes policies, practices, and procedures. CAFE has brought together parents, teachers, principals, and community activists to help fight together.
And last but not least, we have Regina Williams Preston from Black Lives Matter South Bend. Regina is a South Bend native and co-founder of Black Lives Matter. As the Dean of School Culture at Navarre Middle School, public school teacher, community organizer, and former South Bend Common Councilwoman, Regina leverages political power for equity in schools, city government, and neighborhoods. Her advocacy has been the catalyst for structural changes that promote equity in institutions throughout the city of South Bend. As past president of the board of the Community Forum for Economic Justice, she organized campaigns to help city leaders from the school board to the city administration in creating people-centered policy with all stakeholders at the table. Recognizing the intersectionality of education, economic justice, and human and civil rights, her professional work is rooted in the tenets of transformative justice and restorative economics. Her work in South Bend has been featured in national media, including the Young Turks, CNN, BuzzFeed, NBC News, BET.com, and the New York Times, etc. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here today.
Now we want to start with our panelist presentations, and I'm welcoming Ms. Aletha, and her presentation will be on education and policing.
Good evening. I'm going to jump right in. The South Bend Community School Corporation was placed under a court-ordered consent decree by the United States Department of Justice. The decree is part of a judgment by the United States Supreme Court called the Brown versus Board of Education. This ruling strikes down the practice of separate but equal education for minorities and declares it unlawful. The consent decree is under the old law that speaks to where we are today. Before the Board of Education ruling, Black students were given a badge of inferiority through segregation of schools. However, even after this unanimous court decision, many school systems were not willing to let go of prejudice and discrimination. Although some would claim these practices are unintentional, the effects are still the same. And to drive this point home, to really understand the South Bend consent order, I would like to read just one paragraph of the original court document when our corporation was placed under this order. The United States has filed a complaint alleging that the South Bend Community School Corporation, its Board of School Trustees, and its superintendent have engaged in acts of discrimination, which were intended and had the effects of segregating students and faculty on the basis of race in the school system. The United States alleges further that the defendants' discriminatory actions had a system-wide effect and that those actions continue to cause, in large part, the patterns of racial imbalance in student assignment which persists today. That was in the early 1980s. Moving through the 80s, during the 1990s, we found that families were experiencing ongoing disparities in discipline and labeling to the point that a group of predominantly African-American parents and community stakeholders started speaking out. On March 15th, 1999, one of the members of the group was speaking when 4 members of the board walked out. The intent was to humiliate the speaker, thereby shutting down the conversation. But it backfired. As you can see, she is still here and the conversation intensified. In the latter part of 1999, a well-respected community organization hired ThoughtBridge. ThoughtBridge is a renowned organization from Cambridge, Massachusetts, that helps school corporations in conflict resolutions. And I'm just going to read for you just 2 of the findings of ThoughtBridge and their conclusion with their diagnostic report presented to the school corporation and the community in April 2000. Race is, without question, the #1 undiscussable in the South Bend community. Everyone, regardless of race, ethnicity, class, or gender, named this as one of the most divisive emotional issues in the community. When one couples this fact with an almost universal perception that the system fails to educate minority, poor, and average students well, this inability is destructive to a major goal of the South Bend Community School Corporation, educating all kids well. All agreed the community has no constructive means for discussing and dealing with this and other undiscussables. For African Americans, this translates into a lack of respect. They are concerned about a lack of commitment to tackling the poor results their children often get from their education. And one other finding, many of the respondents re-interviewed pointed out the South Bend Community Schools does a poor job of meeting the needs of children who are in the middle, such as those on a non-college track, vocational, trade, poor, minorities, especially African-American males, average achievers, those who are labeled difficult, have behavioral problems, or those whom the system doesn't understand or to whom it doesn't relate. We can almost say that we are still living in that time. Now we're moving on to the year 2000, directly after this report was presented. At the turn of the century, the year 2000, the school board took the corporation in the direct opposite of where it was and hired a new superintendent. After solidifying their reorganization plan that drew strong opposition from a cross-section of the community, the superintendent in 2004 introduced her Project Respect. This was a partnership with the JJC and the juvenile court judge at that time. Although they never admitted it, but it was to establish zero tolerance policies, one of which was to utilize uniformed armed police. Now, before, the corporation had security, which included police, but they were in plain clothes. Now, you want to keep in mind that at this time, most of the incidents that were occurring were typical childhood behaviors. As education chair for the South Bend NAACP, I started receiving complaints from parents that their child received citations in the amount of $135, some for fighting and others for minor offenses. We worked with some of these parents to bring about awareness and assisted them with media interviews. Then we started receiving complaints about police intimidation tactics. The corporation was now in a clear pattern of over-policing. These patterns were prevalent statewide, nationwide, and calls for justice intensified in 2007 when the United Nations brought a complaint against the U.S. for its treatment of Black students in education. At that time, the Indiana legislature called for a commission on disproportionality for students of color, which in turn triggered the first law to address discrimination in schools for students of color and particularly Black males. In 2010, at the federal level, under President Barack Obama, 63 cities in Indiana were cited because of discriminatory practices, particularly for Black students. South Bend was among the 63 cities that were cited, and you want to keep in mind that the corporation was already under a consent order. And I would have to say, because of some excellent reporting on behalf of our local newspaper, these issues were disclosed, which triggered an increase in awareness and activism within the city. In 2011, the South Bend School Corporation received another report from ThoughtBridge. They called it ThoughtBridge, a new beginning. And very quickly, I would just like to read you the introduction. In preparing, and this is from ThoughtBridge, this is the second ThoughtBridge report in 2011 on the corporation. In preparing to write this report, Kai ThoughtBridge went back to read the April 2000 ThoughtBridge report written for the Community Foundation of St. Joseph County on the South Bend Community School Corporation. We wanted to see what had changed and what has stayed the same in the 11 years since we last visited South Bend. There is bad news and good news. The bad news is that not only has there been little action to address and resolve the issues raised in 2000, that inaction has exacerbated the existing problems and created new problems for the corporation. The good news is that the new problems seem to have served as a catalyst for change. In November of 2010, an overwhelming vote, the community voted out all 3 school board incumbents, and that changed the board composition, and the early actions of the newly constituted board have rekindled hope that the South Bend schools can turn itself in the kind of school district it needs to be. I would like to say we had that same hope in 2018 because we had 3 new school board members, and the high hope was that we were going to really get change. Now, I would like to just let you know that by this time in 2011, the corporation again was under the citation and under a court order to devise a plan to reverse discrimination in discipline and in misdiagnosing Black students to special education. It was a system-wide engagement. It was making some progress until in 2014, the board president dismantled the process. This took the corporation backward. Until 2018, we received a mandate from the DOJ and the federal court to reestablish interventions and practices of restorative justice, PBIS and MTSS. The mandate is still into effect today. In fact, it brings us to present. We, the corporation, and South Bend Community School Board trustees received a letter in August of 2021 from the DOJ informing us, and I can sum this up in one sentence, and I quote, "Our review of this data exposed both longstanding issues and new inconsistencies that severely compromise the corporation's ability to uniformly implement its code. The corporation should immediately address these issues if it intends to comply with this bedrock requirement of stipulation." And I would like to simply conclude that in terms and in dealing with it, when we're talking about the SRO issue, which is the latest issue that we had, school resource officers, whether we're talking about police in schools or school resource officers, in essence, coming full circle, we can see the progression from when armed uniformed police officers were placed in schools on a regular basis. We went from a threat of citations being given to intimidation to now possible abuse. So I would just like to say that I did witness a video, and it made the news, in which a student had a vape, and it was reported that the student headbutted the officer. And I specifically, along with me, another board member, had asked to see the video. And in this video, we didn't see the student headbutt the officer. What we did see was that student was tackled to the ground. But now it's a situation where it's out of the corporation's hands, it's now into the hands of the police. Literally, we were witnessing the school to prison pipeline, where students are actually tracked from schools into the prison system. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Jones, for your presentation. And now we're moving to Jordan Geiger's presentation on environmental justice.
Right. Hello, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here this evening. And I also want to thank the organizers of this event, of course, members of the Accomplice Project, and also student leaders in the Notre Dame BLM Coalition for planning and co-sponsoring this event. The issue of reparations has been hotly contested since the emancipation of African descendants in the US. In the last 2 years, primarily since the uprisings around the murder of George Floyd, community organizers, social and racial justice organizations, elected officials, and freedom and justice-loving folks around the country have taken up the issue of reparations in more critical ways. Today, there are over 100 co-sponsors on the federal reparations study bill that is moving through the US House of Representatives. And there are folks in cities and communities across the country who are investigating how they can leverage local resources to work towards reparatory justice for African descendants. And so there are some examples in Illinois. There's some folks doing work around cannabis revenues. So there's interesting work happening throughout the country. And I think presently there's about, I know in Evanston is one of the most recent communities where they've implemented local reparations, where they're giving actual direct dollars to families. It's kind of a pilot. But since that started, I think about 60 communities have been looking at implementing a similar kind of program. So the question we're exploring this evening is, what is the case for reparations for Black South Bend? I'm here tonight, as mentioned by Love, to discuss the potential impact of environmental racism on Black South Bend. In recent years, there's been much attention given to the local lead crisis. In December 2016, the South Bend Tribune wrote a jarring piece about the possible lead epidemic in South Bend homes. The article generated tremendous conversation and concern among community members and various stakeholders. And at the time, the city of South Bend had little to no resources to carry out risk assessments on homes and lead remediation of homes. Blood testing collected by the Indiana Department of Health over a 10-year period between 2005 and 2015 found that one neighborhood on the near northwest side of South Bend, which is known as Census Tract 6. If you don't know what a census tract is, you think of the city and its borders. And then within those borders, there are smaller geographical areas called census tracts. So Census Tract 6 is what is commonly known as the NNN, or the near northwest neighborhood. Some of you might live there or know someone who lives there, perhaps a professor or graduate students. But Census Tract 6 had a unusually high percentage of children under the age of 7 with elevated levels of blood. Elevated levels of lead in their blood. In this census tract, 25% of children tested had elevated levels. And in a neighboring bordering census tract, literally, they share borders like right next to it, Census Tract 19, 44.4% of children tested had elevated levels of lead in their blood. And these census tracts these are census tracts with high concentrations of Black residents. If you're not familiar with the dangers of lead, according to the Indiana Department of Health, lead poisoning has been linked to increased violent behavior among those afflicted, hyperactivity in youth, damage to the brain and nervous system, slowed growth and development, learning behavioral challenges, and underperformance in schools. If you've worked with Black parents who have Black students in South Bend schools, this sounds a lot like how Black children and youth are described when being pushed out of classrooms and schools and thrusted into the school to prison pipeline. Sources of lead exposure in South Bend have been primarily through digestion of paint dust and paint chips. And the testing rates among children in the county is between 10 to 15%, which is markedly low. So I think initially, when they started looking at the data, it was at 10%, and then it kind of went up, and then COVID happened. And so it dipped back down, but it's between 10 to 15% presently. And researchers in the area have noted exceedingly low testing rates among children receiving Medicaid. And this is deeply troubling because Medicaid, which is a federal health insurance program for low-income children and families, requires that children under the age of 5 be tested for lead. According to the South Bend Tribune, since 2018, the city of South Bend has received $7 million in federal funding to abate lead in homes. The funding allows for homeowners and landlords to have their properties remediated at no cost to them, receiving up to $15,000 per household in aid. As of January 2021, less than 10 homes have been abated since 2018. Census Tract 6, 19, 21, and 30 are 4 out of 7 census tracts with the highest risk of lead contamination. These census tracts also have an overrepresentation of Black folks in comparison to the share of the city's total population as a whole. I think Census Tract 6, or when I looked at the data, Census Tract 6 had a Black population of 40%. 19 had a population of like 57%, 21, it was pretty high. And I think 30 was about 35% Black folks. Local lead expert and University of Notre Dame professor Heidi Burnett spoke before the South Bend Common Council in January 2021. I was actually present at that meeting virtually. And she was unequivocally clear that lead poisoning is a racial justice issue in South Bend. And she is leading efforts in the innovation lab here at South Bend, where they've created testing kits for homes that may be exposed to lead. And there's I think the data had showed at the time, I think around, it might have came from 2015, about 68,000 homes and households in the county were built prior to 1980. And any home built prior to 1978 is likely to have lead-based paint in it. So just keeping what Heidi said in mind, as we think about what Olitha shared about Black children being punished for typical childlike behaviors in the classroom, talking or talking back, hyperactivity, running, playing, and other disruptive or so-called disruptive behaviors. And as we think about the fact that West Side schools are being primarily monitored by the state for low performance, we should also consider what role lead contamination has played into this. We should also do the same as we think about Black on Black violence in the city of South Bend. As the city looks to increase policing in low-income Black communities because of an increase in violent crimes over the last couple years, we should ask ourselves if our city is criminalizing folks for being poor, Black, and exposed to lead and other harmful contaminants. Another example of environmental racism would have been mentioned in Lauren's presentation if we got a chance to finish it. But she spoke a little bit or named a community in the LaSalle Park area, which is affectionately known as the Lakeside. It's a largely Black neighborhood, again, located near LaSalle Park, which is situated on top of Beck's Lake. The neighborhood is known for its large hill in the park. But what many might not know is that the hill is a former dump site and landfill. And the entire area was once swampland, which some developers have argued makes the area undesirable for housing development because the houses and porches are likely to sink. The Lakeside was one of the few areas where Black folks could live and buy homes in the early 20th century of South Bend and South Bend's history. After World War I, the federal government began building homes in the segregated neighborhood for Black migrant families. These homes were usually small, consisting of 2 bedrooms, a living room, and a kitchen. There were no indoor bathrooms until years later. At that time, companies were dumping waste materials where the park is now located. In the 1930s, Bendix Company, which is now Honeywell Corporation, began dumping toxic waste in the area. Asbestos, arsenic, plating, and paint wastes, solvents and oils, and arsenic contaminated foundry sand are suspected to have been disposed in this area. After World War II, a second wave of Black migrants moved to South Bend and settled in the neighborhood, including my own family. The dumping continued into the 1950s, and older residents remember when homes and businesses located near the LaSalle Park were torn down and dumped into the landfill. Eventually, a grassy hill covered the landfill and is today a hallmark feature of LaSalle Park. Like even myself, when it was snow, we would actually sled down the hill and everything. And this park was actually built in from the mid-1950s into the 1960s. There's a center there called the Charles Black Center. I believe that was built in the 1960s. In 1989, the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, designated the area as a hazardous waste site. In 2013, the South Bend Tribune published an article about the site and interviewed a woman, a former resident named Bernita Johnson, who grew up in the neighborhood. The Tribune wrote, Johnson, 56, grew up on West Washington Street in one of a number of concrete block houses that line what is now the southern edge of the park. and she remembers playing in the muck that made up much of the area at the time. And then they're quoting her here. It was a gray muck. I would play in that stuff. Johnson, who now lives in the city south side, told the Tribune on Wednesday. And out of that muck would come, it would be like a form of steam coming from it. I will never forget it as long as I live. Johnson said she later developed spots on her legs that she attributed to exposure to contaminated soil in the park, which served, again, as a dumping site for the Bendix Corp and others for about 40 years before the mid-1950s. She goes on to say that my back leg started to turn colors. I started to get spots on my leg. And over time, it started to spread all over my body. It affected me, Johnson said of the condition, which persists undiagnosed to this day. I never could wear a swimsuit like other kids. I wore pants in the summertime to cover my legs because I was embarrassed. Residents in the area have grown frustrated over the decades as they waited for definitive answers on how dangerous and hazardous the contaminants are. When I attended a meeting in 2016 with Regina when she was a councilwoman at the time for the district, the city shared that the waste was of no immediate risk to the residents. However, many residents were not satisfied with that news. Some discussed how everyone in the community knew someone who died from cancer in the neighborhood. Elder Dennis Plump, a longtime community organizer, stressed that any exposure to arsenic over time was harmful to the human body. As recently as last week, some good news. The city's plan to remediate the lead and arsenic in the soil was finally approved by the EPA. Environmental racism has long plagued South Bend's Black community. Black people have been forced to live in contaminated housing on some of the worst land in the city and experience hardship in improving their living conditions due to redlining and racial discrimination, deindustrialization and job loss, lack of education, persistent health disparities, and entrenched generational poverty. Unfortunately, little attention is given to the impact of environmental racism on Black people in South Bend over time. When I hear folks talk about crime and the disintegration of the Black family, I usually press them to consider the totality of the conditions in which Black people live, especially given that harmful drugs like crack cocaine were intentionally flooded into the Black community in order to destabilize them. It's time that we as a city and a community look more critically at this issue and strongly consider and lay out a plan for redress. So those are my remarks on environmental racism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for your presentation. And now, last but not least, we move to Regina Williams-Preston on a presentation on housing and gentrification.
If you know me at all, you know I can be verbose. So I tried to write this out and I'm going to probably read kind of fast. So just let me know. All right. So since the earliest times when Europeans landed on these shores, it's always been about the land. Land is wealth. And we don't have to go all the way back to slavery to find cause for reparations. Ta-Nehisi Coates made the case for reparations in 2014, citing well-documented issues concerning housing discrimination, like contract buying in Chicago. You guys know all about that? I'm seeing some heads, yes, no. But that would be one place to start, calculating the debt owed to real people alive today. Contract buying was just one form of discrimination by real estate dealers in the 60s. And a new study found that the city's Black families lost between $3 billion and $4 billion in wealth because of predatory housing contracts during the 1950s and 60s. Meanwhile, just 100 miles east of Chicago, in this place we call home, racial covenants, redlining, and other discriminatory practices segregated neighborhoods, dismantled Black communities, and systematically stripped Black families of their homes, preventing them from passing on assets that could build generational wealth. Since the Great Migration, of Black families from the South, current residents of South Bend have amassed story after story of families struggling to acquire and hold on to the American dream of home ownership. But just about every 10 years or so, the city has a plan. And that plan includes acquisition of land and revitalization of Black neighborhoods for the benefit of white residents. So in the 50s, the city had a plan. It was about keeping Blacks out. The story of Better Homes of South Bend, 22 families fought discrimination to integrate neighborhoods north of Lincoln Way West. In fact, 60 years later, in a full circle kind of moment, the book you may have read recently was commissioned by the Far Northwest Neighborhood Association as an organizing tool to tell this proud history of our neighborhood in an effort to stop demolition of the homes that our ancestors fought so hard to build. I say ancestors, but like, I know these people, like they're my grandparents, right? One of the very first homes constructed, 1702 North Elmer Street, was the home of Leroy Cobb, the last surviving member of Better Homes of South Bend. But it fell to demolition in the 1,000 Houses in 1,000 Days initiative. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So that was the 50s. Well, guess what? In the 60s, the city had a plan. Y'all ever heard of that phrase? I think it was James Baldwin who said, urban renewal is Negro. You got it, Negro removal. The city called for redevelopment of the West Side. The Odom family has lived on the lake for over 100 years. They founded Layman's Chapel Church, and Dorothy Odom, who turns 95 this year, is matriarch of this proud legacy family. In the mid to late 60s, Miss Odom was forced to sell their home as the city decided to redevelop the land. Well, they were fortunate enough to be able to buy property and build right across the street from their original homestead. Of note, after acquiring and demolishing their home and the homes of their neighbors, the city never did build on that lot. Today, it remains an empty space. The stories go on and on throughout the decades, neighborhood by neighborhood. Black families are displaced to make way for white prosperity. In the 70s, it was the East Side around Pearly School. In the 80s, West Washington Street, like the Black businesses that were there for generations. And guess what? In the 90s, the city had a plan for the Southeast Side. What is now the Boys and Girls Club, Ivy Tech, and JJC used to be a Black neighborhood of beautiful homes. The city purchased the Pope family home at 713 Kesey Street for $15,000. One of the sons was actually still living in the home. But in the end, even though they said they were going to keep the home because it was in beautiful shape, the city tore the house down. That Southeast Side was redeveloped. In 2000, the city, and guess what? The university was a part of it too. The revitalization of the neighborhood around Notre Dame. But this time, they were going to redevelop with the neighbors. They partnered with the NNRO, I think it stands for Near Northeast Revitalization Organization. They created a board consisting half of people from the neighborhood and half of organizations, government entities, businesses, and of course, Notre Dame. And you can see the physical results of that redevelopment today, right? All over, it's really beautiful. $1 million homes along streets in the neighborhood that had not seen investment in decades. What you can't see are what you might call the psychological results. That neighborhood before revitalization was 99% Black. And guess what? Today, it's 99%. You got it. They'll tell you that everyone who was displaced moved to a beautiful home in other parts of the city. But what we have done is separated neighbors and dispersed a rich community of people to the far corners of the city. Yes, they partnered with the community, but they used the same tools of economic development that we've used for decades. So you know what they say, if you do what you've always done, you'll get You guys are good. I'm a middle school teacher. I do this all day long, right? If you do what we've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten. And what we've always gotten was gentrification, displacement of people of color, and poor people. So you see, racial discrimination is not as explicit, and I'll be generous to say, at least not to the people making policy. I'm being generous. But no matter the intention, the impact of discriminatory practices are known and felt by Black families generation after generation. Most recently in 2012, the city had a plan. The Vacant and Abandoned Task Force, the 1,000 Houses in 1,000 Days, and in 2014, West Side Main Street's plan were all initiatives that just in the last 10 years, though today, perpetuate that discrimination. I tell you, I say this to people all the time. It's like, I kind of came to this work very late in life. I was in my 40s before I really started paying attention to local government and local politics. I would go do my duty and vote for president, right? But it wasn't until I personally felt the impacts of what was happening and I started to investigate, like, wait, what's going on downtown? That I realized that local politics rule your life. And it was August 8th, 2012. It was a Wednesday at 1 p.m. There was a public meeting for the Vacant and Abandoned Task Force. Did you catch that? Wednesday at 1 p.m? Come on down, everybody who's actually working and can never make it. Fortunately, I was a teacher, so I could be there. And it was the first meeting and the first question, Pete, he said, okay, everybody, we have all these vacant homes. How can we get these homes in the hands of the city? And there were like 2 of us there, right? And the director of code enforcement raised her hand and she said, well, what we can do is we can increase the amount that we charge for fines for code violations. And then we can make it easier to find people so we don't have to have all those hearings. And then once people start feeling the financial burden, then they'll just donate their home to the city. And Pete leaned over to his chief of staff.
Pete was the mayor.
Pete was the mayor. I'm sorry, Pete Buttigieg. You might have heard of him. He leaned over to his chief of staff and he said, we don't have a process for donation of homes to the city. Let's make that. And best believe by next week on the front screen of the website of the city of South Bend, there's a big button that said, donate your house. And it said, has your home become a financial burden? And sure enough, we started seeing exactly what the plan was. So I'll give you a couple of examples, because again, I want you to understand that this is personal. There are real people and real lives that are impacted by this policy. So there was Mary, who after paying exorbitant fines, literally $1,500 a month after month, one ticket, $1,500 a month. She was forced to donate her home to the city to avoid additional fines and fees. Sherry agreed to have her home demolished for $5,000 with a plan to rebuild on the lot with Habitat for Humanity, a fully accessible home that her medically fragile child could grow up in. Months after demolition was complete, she had not received an invoice. So when she called down to follow up, she was told she owed $36,000 for the demolition. Remember, she was quoted $5,000. Long story short, she couldn't pay it, and the lot she hoped would be her forever home was lost to tax sale. She had no house and no lot to build on. Alicia, this is a good one, easy. They demolished the wrong house. They weren't even supposed to knock her house down. They hit the wrong one. That's for real. Yes. Finally, Tanya, she owned a neighborhood bar and grill. And we actually have a recording of the code enforcement director explaining how he trains his inspectors to go by a house one day. They see tall grass and litter. But that day they only cite it for tall grass. They come back the next day and cite it for litter. And that way, he says, we can move the property into nuisance status more quickly. And he said, this is how we target people that we want to get out of the neighborhood. Yeah, for real, it's recorded. So the stories go on and on. So my friends, yes, racism and institutional oppression is alive and well in our city government and our education system. And in spite of the intention, the impact is devastating to Black people. The Alice report from the United Way tells us that 54% of working people in South Bend live paycheck to paycheck. The recent revitalization was touted all across the country. I think it was 2011. Forbes magazine named City of South Bend the #1 city for young people to move to and get rich. Well, what about the people who already live here? What we know is that this prosperity has been seen by a very small group of people. The rich get richer. So I'm here today to say, now we know this is personal. Real lives are being impacted by these injustices, not 400 years ago, but right now, today. So what are you going to do about it?
Thank you so much to our panelists. I prepared a few questions for our panelists, but I'd just like to put a plug here. One of our accomplice co-managers, Lene, is working very tirelessly online on Zoom to record questions from anyone online. So you guys who weren't able to make it here in person, please don't feel left out. Please put your questions in the chat and Lene will make a note of it. So I'll go into my questions and then we'll open it up for questions from anyone here in the room. So I'll start with an easy one. What is the responsibility of the City of South Bend and of Notre Dame to Black reparations in South Bend? What are some visible, measurable actions that the university and the city should commit to in the short, medium, and long term? I'll open this up to any one of our panelists who feels like they feel called to speak on this.
I'll just say quickly in terms of the city, I know from working with neighborhood organizations and then speaking with people specifically on the lakeside, which is a far west side community, they've been calling for, a neighborhood plan. They've been calling for investment in housing. They've been calling for various kinds of improvements in the neighborhood, from lighting to improve sidewalks to fix streets. Now, I will say that when I was younger, the streets were in horrible shape, like horrible shape, just awful potholes in the street. So things have improved over time. But given that so many, because the lake is situated in District 2, and District 2 was one of the districts that had the most demolitions of houses. And so that housing stock has not been replaced. And so what folks are calling for is more good, clean, and affordable housing in the area so that folks can move from being renters to homeowners. Last year, we participated in the city budget process. Our organization released the Black People's Budget. And one of our demands was to invest in neighborhood plans specifically for that area and other neighborhoods. And we've not gotten a commitment from the city. So you'll look on the news and you'll see, oh, they're going to invest in housing. Oh, they're going to put up plans. But there's no specificity. So it's not clear which neighborhoods, which organizations are going to be supported by the $60 million that came from the federal government in the form of the American Rescue Plan funding. So that's just like one small way. I mean, we're talking about a neighborhood plan is like $150,000, right? Like one small way the city can move the needle and invest in neighborhoods and give folks more confidence and more belief that the city actually cares about their concerns. I know you got something to say.
Yeah, when we were in a planning meeting, I overheard that. I don't think they thought I was listening. They overheard, I overheard them say, Regina, she'll fill up the time. Don't worry, she talks a lot. Yeah. I told on y'all. It's okay. So yeah, I do have a couple of things that I wanted to say. So, and I kind of really focused on Notre Dame because I think most of you guys are from Notre Dame. And this is where you can use your voice in that nd.edu address to really push for change. So with regards to real estate and housing in South Bend, you guys may have heard, you guys have a new institute here called the Fitzgerald Institute for Real Estate. How many of you guys have heard of that? Yeah, I heard about that coming this summer. It's called FIRE. And that's why I felt like doing this, yelling, FIRE! Oh my God, right? So it educates and inspires students, combining theory and ethical practice to engage industry and public policy to create places of lasting value. And when the guy was talking about it, he was like, oh, we're going to use South Bend. Like, that's going to be great. We're going to send our students out there and redevelop South Bend with housing. So yeah, I was terrified, right? So the question, what I think that you can do is, interrogate that, right? Talk to your faculty. The other thing, I found it online and I looked at the sheet that said faculty, there were 57 people. And this was the visual I wanted to share. It was all white men and women, maybe a couple of people from India. I don't know. But I didn't see anybody from South Bend. And this is our home. So I would say interrogate that and let's investigate what they're doing. And think about, like, how are you guys actually developing new tools for redevelopment, right? There's a whole racial wealth divide report that we put together that was commissioned by the city that gave 10 questions to ask yourself anytime you're making any decisions around economic development. They should be using that, right? So how can this actually be a framework for repairing harm due to housing discrimination in South Bend? And I think that would probably align really well with the Catholic mission of Notre Dame. So get on them, y'all. Another thing, and this is, again, coming out of what you guys, did you know about the Higgins labor program and their just wage initiative? Awesome stuff. It's like a whole matrix to help companies, big and small, figure out how to pay a just wage. What's fair? What makes sense? We should use that at Notre Dame. What do you think? That'd be good, right? So you created it here. Let's use us as a prototype. Notre Dame is the largest employer in the city of South Bend. This will impact education, like somewhere like 75, 78% of children going to our South Bend schools live in poverty. I bet some of their families are employed by Notre Dame. What a difference it would make to see their household income come up to a living wage, a just wage. Finally, just in general, I don't know if you ever heard of mapping prejudice out of Minneapolis. We should do that here. Notre Dame actually brought them here. They did a wonderful thing a few years ago, and they had a whole seminar. And the Minneapolis folk talked about how they were actually looking back at the racial covenants and understanding that cities weren't always segregated racially. It wasn't until like the 50s when they decided that they didn't want Black people or other people of color living with white people. So let's do that, but then let's put some action to it, right? Look at the racial wealth divide report. Set some goals. When you see that Blacks, only 38% of them own their own home, what can we do about it? That's a baseline. So let's set some benchmarks and create programming to move Blacks into home ownership. Thank you.
Can I just add one more thing? Sure. Also, home repair is a big issue in South Bend. So a number of 2017, we were able to, Regina was on the council, we would allow the city administration to actually set aside millions of dollars for new construction housing, and also I think about 1.1 or 1.3 million dollars for home repair for owner occupied housing. Now that was important at the time because when you look at the home ownership rates by race and ethnicity, Black people have the lowest home ownership rate in the city of South Bend. I think it's about 35%. And for whites and Latinos, it's like 63 and 65% or something like that, much higher. And we wanted to focus on helping our elders in the neighborhood because our elders are more likely to own their homes. And as Regina mentioned, with all the penalties and the fines and the predatory code enforcement practices, they were being targeted because they were essentially being penalized for being too poor to repair their homes. And so we figured that by the city was already getting federal dollars, federal home grant dollars to repair homes, but there were conditions or I'm losing my words here. There were just stipulations on it that made it very difficult for the federal funding for people to be able to access it. So the city put on additional like $600,000. Typically, they got about $500,000 from the federal government. So they added civil funds so that more households could actually afford or qualify, I should say, to get funding to repair their homes. And they could receive up to $20,000 to repair their homes. And that would come in the form of repairs to their roofs, their windows. They could knock off certain walls. And there were 4 targeted areas on the west side in District 2. And these were areas that historically had not received this funding. And so you had a number of residents who had applied for it, who were really excited about it, who were ready to knock down the city hall doors to get to it. And unfortunately, there were, and our vision for it was that we could actually have Black people in the community who are contractors build or repair the home, so that young Black people and elders could see Black people fixing our communities, helping our elders out. Fortunately, the city just kind of slow walked the whole program, and the funding really hasn't made it to the communities. So I think presently, I think last year they had disclosed at the end of last year, there was still about like $700 and something thousand left in the pot. And now they're discussing dispersing the money all across the city to be more inclusive, right? So this is a way of like taking away from communities that have been historically left out and marginalized. So just a home repair program, like a small program such as that, could do a lot in repairing harm for Black South Benders. And I can speak to that because, like, growing up in the Lakeside, in one of these impact areas, you know, my great grandfather was a sharecropper. He couldn't read or write, and he worked for a meatpacking plant. He made about 32 cents an hour. So his home was his pride and joy, and he worked very hard to maintain it. Got really old. He was obviously income restricted, living on Social Security, about $800 a month. Couldn't really afford major home repairs. So we literally were living in a house that we owned, thankfully, right? So there was some wealth, but there were like gaping holes in the ceiling. The rain was coming through. I mean, these are the conditions that our children are living in. So we could do a lot in moving our city forward and repairing Black communities by making targeted investments in certain programs like those.
Thank you so much. I'll ask just one more question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. So what compelled you to participate in this panel? And going forward, what gives you hope? And that is hope for South Bend. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think one of the main reasons I was invited.
Okay, so that's a good start.
I appreciate that. Another reason is I just feel that it's incumbent up on me with what I know of the history of, and I don't profess to be an expert on anything, but what I've experienced actually, and the work that I've done with this NAACP, that it's important that we are able to have these real tough conversations centered around race. I mean, nationally, statewide, we're hearing a lot of people expressing, if we're going to really solve these issues, we're going to have to be able to talk about race. And I believe that that is one of the number one thing. I'm hopeful that our corporation will get to and grow to that point where we can comfortably have that conversation. I can tell you, looking back 20 years ago, we have moved the needle a little bit. We are starting to talk about these issues. Now we have to move from talking about them to making sure that we are actually doing the work to address the systemic barriers that have crippled the potential for so many of our young people. So number one, I appreciate the invitation, which is number one reason. Number two, I'm always looking for, when you've lived something for so long, it becomes a part of you and you just want to give it away. So I'm always appreciative of the opportunity to share and to exhort and to reason when it comes to trying to make sure that we're providing the very best for every single child. Thank you.
So I'll share that, I'm participating in this panel because, South Bend is a small town and we can really do something here if we have the will. So, I've participated in panels like this in the past. I will in the future, but, I'll share this with you on a personal note. I can remember back in the early 70s, I was just a little thing like 5 and 6, like literally. And my dad was a community organizer. And I remember professors from Notre Dame coming, talking, I'd be around, running around, playing in the floor, something like that. He used to come up here and speak at Notre Dame. And it's been really recently that I kind of started looking through old newspapers and things. Like he actually ran for mayor back in the day in 75. And I was looking at his platform and I got chills because I was shocked. But the exact same things that we are pushing for today, he was pushing for back in 1975. And so my caveat to having these conversations is that I don't want it to be my kids coming up here, speaking to professors at Notre Dame, talking about the same old stuff. Like my hope is that with the help of the Accomplice Project, don't you love that name? Like we're going to actually get something done. We're not just going to talk about it. We're going to move the needle in real time to help real people who are our neighbors in South Bend now.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to open up the floor now to the audience to ask questions. We're going to allow our online participants first, and I'm going to have Lene read out one or two of those questions, and then we're going to move on to our in-person participants.
Okay, so first we have a question from Marilyn Gachow. I really hope I pronounced your last name right. First, where can parents and neighborhood organizations get lead testing kits? And what were the results of the city's earlier testing of lead ground contamination on LaSalle's Parks property?
So I know you can get, and correct me if I'm wrong, Regina, I know you can get the lead testing kits from the Innovation Center here at Notre Dame. And then you can also contact the NNN or the Near Northwest Neighborhood Association to get kits as well. They have neighborhood organizers who go out and give out the kits to families and households that are interested in them. What was the other part of the question? I'm sorry.
It was what were
the soil testing, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So from the report, the EPA reports that I've read recently, again, they say that there's no immediate risk, but there is lead and arsenic in the soil. And you have to get special approval through the EPA to actually dig into the soil. So when they added on to and rehabbed the Charles Black Center, they had to get a special designation or permission through the EPA to do that. Also recently, when we were having a conversation about planting more trees in the second district, because there's literally not enough oxygen, they said that they couldn't plant trees in the park because they couldn't dig into the ground. So the city has a remediation plan for cleaning and removing the toxins out of the soil, I believe in certain places. And so that plan was just recently approved by the EPA last week. Like an email just came out like Thursday. Yeah, and it was in the newspaper as well.
And then the other question, which I think would go to all of the panelists, is from Anthony Vasoli. And he asks, what is your proposal for funding of reparations? What would be qualifications for receiving reparations?
I mean, I'll say that I really honestly haven't sat down and said, this is what we should do for reparations. I think the language and like what's in my head is really very much, I'm not saying that shouldn't happen. We need to do that, but I just haven't had that conversation with myself or too many people. But what we can do is start talking about how do we stop the harm? How can we look at what's happening right now or what's been lost very recently, kind of as I said, and put some numbers on that. I think that's very, very easy. There were 760 some homes that were demolished in 1,000 houses in 1,000 days. Let's investigate each and every one of those homes. Let's see who owned them. Let's see how much they lost. Let's see what we can do to help them gain that back.
Thank you. I'm going to open up the floor now to questions from our in-person attendees, and I'm going to have Gavin run the mic for us.
I have a comment.
Okay.
Can I do that?
Yeah. Do you want the microphone?
No, I don't need it. I've got a big mouth.
Yeah.
Okay. Some of y'all know me.
Is that on?
I used to work with Christina Brooks in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And this whole subject of quote unquote reparations came up at that time. And we took a look at where poor people were in South Bend. And the numbers were so discouraging. We found one census tract where the poverty rate over 10 years went up 211%.
Wow.
We said, what can we do? And so what we thought about doing was trying to go to the top 10 procurers in the city of South Bend and say, if you guys give us 1/10 of 1% of your procurement budget, that will generate $90 million. That'll give us some money to make a start on building affordable housing. That'll give us a start on training some young Black and other minority men and women on construction trades and how to do supplies. In other words, start businesses. I'm a pessimist, Regina. I honestly, I've been talking to people all over the country, right? And everybody kind of getting fed up with this whole thing about reparations. This country has been false to the past, false to the present, and it looked like it's going to be false to the future. Maybe it's time that we do what America has always done. Y'all know how we got this wonderful country, right? We took it.
Oh.
Taking it the American way. For time immemorial, Black people in this country have watched you kill us, use us as bed warmers, beat the hell out of us, throw us out of homes, concentrate us in projects and then separate men from their children. When did we finally do the American thing? I guess that's why I'm a pessimist. See, and I talked to some guys in Indy. There's a slowly burgeoning movement. People should be very careful. This country is under the surface. It's bubbling, bubbling, bubbling. People don't even know what they're asking for when you slow walk progress. The poverty rate in South Bend for Blacks is 4 times that of whites. Now they talking about tearing down 238 units of public housing. You say, gee, Joe, they're gonna build it back. Yeah, right, maybe, maybe not. There's already an affordable housing crisis in South Bend, especially among seniors. What happens when they tear down Monroe Circle with all those women and children? What happened when they finish off Rabbi Schulman, where poor old people used to live? Where they gonna live now? What about the people that don't have affordable housing now that's struggling? Do we really know what we're doing? Are we just gonna sit back and watch them literally destroy people? And that's why there's a different kind of movement in certain sectors of America that say, you know what, these people ain't changing, we gotta change. These people ain't gonna help us, we gotta help us. And they didn't get it by taking bonjour or shalom or none of that stuff. They took it. Black took it. So far, we're gonna have to learn that lesson. Okay, that's enough of my.
Any other questions or comments from our in-person attendees?
I hate to try to follow that for sure. That was amazing. I have a much less comprehensive question about money, specifically focusing on South Bend. When I look at the school and what's going on in the schools, I can't help but see what's been going on with cutting the money coming to South Bend to even pay for the schools, which weren't good 20 years ago, right? And they're cutting. So if we're going to talk about making things better for people in the schools, where the heck is the money coming from? That's my one question, because it's a bigger than South Bend problem, right? If I'm not mistaken on that, because, I don't have to tell you, right? Nowhere. And then when it comes to the housing issues, it sounds like what you're saying is the money, there's money. The money's coming from the Biden administration. And it's not just for the bill, it's everything else. Somehow it gets into city council and they sit on it and they say, well, we can't hire somebody to look after that, because if we do that, then they're going to take away, they make up these reasons not to not to spend it on what they're supposed to spend it on. Like, who's getting it? Is my, why are they spreading it to everybody rather than using it for what we were supposed to use it for? So those are my two questions. It seems like there's a big money outside South Bend problem on top. You understand my questions, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, as far as funding, you're right. There's a bigger issue statewide. Okay, yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, funding is always an issue when when we start discussing these matters. But I guess a lot of the issues that I focused on through the years, funding matters, of course, but when you're speaking of matters of race and providing for everyone the same opportunities, funding is important, but there are some things we can do aside from the funding. And so that's where my focus is. But you're right, there's a greater issue. The state's playing into all of this. Then too, we have to be careful that we as a corporation are allocating funds in a fair and equitable way. Because not only is there inequity in curriculum, discipline, straight across the board, there's equity and inequity in funding and how we're funding each and every one. So I believe that if we get to the issues of inequity and really get to the funding will come. Maybe I'm naive, but.
I think it's important to note that the city of South Bend actually has very healthy cash reserves. There's about over $120 million that the city has in reserves. And so some of that money could be used to support some of these programs that folks have been calling for. They're recently reported that they're using that funding to buy the South Bend School Corporation building downtown for about $2 or $3 million. We could put some of that money also towards housing initiatives and other programs that could benefit the community, even investments in children's education around like literacy. We have recreational centers that children, frequent. And oftentimes when you go to them, people are like playing sports and basketball and all of that. And I understand that physical activity is important, but what critical investments are we making in our young people to improve educational outcomes? So there's ways that we can be creative. Obviously, we know like this is a national issue and there's not enough funding available. They were looking to pass the Build Back Better bill, but it didn't pass. But even that, I mean, there was like 120 million or something like that, or billion for to build a million units of affordable housing across the country. I mean, you need that just in New York alone. So we know there's a huge need for money, but again, how do we, leverage the resources that we have, like looking at the reserves, and also how can we be creative? I mean, there are people who are, building container homes. There are people who are looking at different ways to reduce the cost of construction, because the conventional construction in this area to build a home or to construct a home is about, $200,000. And obviously, that's not really affordable for a lot of families. So we just have to be creative and we have to be intentional, and we have to work with community members and leverage, the resources that we have available to us. The money is there. The money is definitely there. And also investments in like Black businesses, like contractors, like the city spends over $100 million on procurement, like Joe had mentioned. And a very small amount of it goes to Black businesses. So even those are like critical, and needed investments that we could make to create more wealth and generate more revenue in the Black community.
I'll just say really quickly, thank you, Jordan. The money is there, statewide, citywide, we have the money. There's like an amazing amount of money. The question is, do we have the will to put it? And you said it already. Do we have the will to put it where it needs to go? And so really we have to have people, I mean, I've been in politics, it's ugly, but we have to vote. You have to know the people. Don't vote for people just because they're Black or just because of this or that. Know their politics and vote for people who are going to make the decisions that align with our values. Bottom line, statewide and locally.
Thank you so much to our panelists for answering our questions, and thank you so much to you guys out there for asking them. We're coming to the end of our time here, so I'll just move it on to Love and Jordan to close for us. If there were any questions we did not get to, please feel free to send them via email to the Accomplice Project, and we'll address them in a later event. Thank you so much.
Yes, I also wanted to say thank you to everyone who showed up in person and also online. I know this is a mix of many different types of people, and from the Notre Dame community and outside of the Notre Dame community. So it's really wonderful to be able to have this conversation as a first step for the future and other things that we are interested in doing. Sorry. But I just also wanted to say that, especially kind of going off of what Regina had said, and this hope of like actually moving the needle, doing things, getting things done. Especially this past year, we've been able to create a coalition with Notre Dame affiliated peoples. And I think this is a really great start for the movement and moving forward and things like this. And so I really, really, really want to implore everyone here, if you're able to join a meeting, use your emails, or just try to take a next step in educating yourself or doing things like that, because it's really, really important, especially as someone that just attends Notre Dame, and being able to see the need and the privilege that I have and we have here, and being able to move forward is really, really important. So I just want to say thank you to everyone, and to also think forward to as well. And then I want to pass this on to Jordan to close our meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, in closing, again, I'll echo everyone else. I want to thank you all for being here in person and online. I've been dealing with a cough, so I'm like, it's like a miracle that I was not coughing throughout the presentation. But I want to, it's a big thing for me. But I want to invite you all into the work. We've been having long conversations. We've been meeting for about, for months, but around this event, like every Sunday for the last 4 or 5 weeks. And we've talked about how can we bring more people from campus into spaces with the community so they can learn more about these issues. We can't, reparations is, again, it's hotly contested. Many folks have different ways that they feel reparations should be handed out. Some people want checks, some people want public investments. Some people want to get land in Africa, like my family. But we have to have these conversations, with each other in community to think about how we can best move forward. And so our plan for this year as an organization is to work with this coalition and also with the Accomplice Project to have, I guess you can say, small group discussions, for the lack of a better term, where individuals like yourselves, can connect with us. And maybe if you have friends or professors, folks who you are acquainted with who are of like mind, we can break bread and have dinner with each other and have these conversations about how we can best move this city forward. You all come with different gifts and skills. You're obviously studying different things. You have various experience, maybe working in different organizations. And so how do we, again, I'll use this term a lot, right? Like leverage all of those skills to improve the conditions that we see in this city and in our community. So we just want to make sure that folks who are not connected with the coalition, who want to be connected, there is a sign-up sheet outside. You can sign up. We'll be sure to email you. And we plan to have a series of conversations, like not similar to these, because these are like panel discussions, but more of like small group discussions where we can eat and hang out and just build bonds with each other and discuss how we can move things forward.
Okay. Thank you so much to Jordan. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thank you.